And this now goes to that other point where a lot of people think that, you know, you do all that training and then when you stop doing it, it all turns to fat. Hello, Aaron Kubitz, personal trainer, functional aesthetic CC, helping average guys perform better inside and outside the gym. Today's video I'm going to be talking about how much volume is required to maintain muscle. So we know that it requires a lot more work to actually build the muscle than to maintain it. The reason I was bringing this up is because I wanted to kind of showcase a little bit of the training that I was doing last week. And watching the training, you might think, man, that's just not a lot of sets. That's not a lot of exercises that you're doing in that workout, especially if you're coming from a bodybuilding background. And so the purpose of this video is to kind of showcase, okay, once you actually build muscle, how much do you need to maintain it? Because this is something that I've had a couple of clients tell me too. They would not want to do certain workouts, certain exercise programs or whatever, because they're like, well, I don't want to have to maintain that. And I think even when I was a kid, my dad said, well, you don't want to, work too hard to build up all the muscle because then it takes a lot of work to maintain it. And then if you don't continue doing that, then it turns to fat. And that actually tends to be a very common belief among most people who are not familiar with strength training, bodybuilding, and stuff like that, or athletics in general. They think that when you stop training, that the muscle that you built during training is then just going to return to fat. And so they would rather not exercise, not see the strength and beauty that their body is capable of, as, was that Aristotle or whatever? I forget what his name was. Anyway, one of the great philosophers who said, it's a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the strength and beauty of which his body is capable of. And so a lot of people would rather not put in the training time, not achieve those results for fear that they won't be able to maintain it when they get older, and thus, what's the point? Because it'll just turn to fat, and then, all that time would have been wasted. And I think the same thing goes for any sort of endeavor in life, is that you think, well, if I go on to put in all this work and all this time to go and do that thing, and then it ultimately doesn't work out, that'll have been a lot of time wasted. The way I look at it, because I've actually had that thought before too, I'm like, what if I go in and put in all this time pursuing the goals that I have for my life, and then it doesn't work out, right? Well, on the flip side, what if you don't put in all that time? Then you're guaranteed of failing. You're guaranteed of just going through doing the same thing over and over and over every day, having your life dictated by other people, because the reality of life is that the person who is most clear on what they want in life is going to dictate the reality of the rest of the people around them that are not clear on what they want out of life. All right, so before we go too much further on in this video, I want to explain the topic from a couple different angles, right? So the first angle would be, what are your training goals, right? What is your priorities at this point in your life? And then the other one would be, within a training cycle, we have things called periodization, right? We have different phases in the cycle. And also, the third thing would be, what does your nutrition look like, right? What is your, because to perform certain kinds of training, it's not enough to go in there and will yourself to do it. You also have to have the fuel to enable yourself to do the particular kind of training that you're doing. So before I started my fitness training business, I was working a regular job, and then I would spend about 4 hours a week doing bodybuilding training, and then on the weekends I'd be doing, in a couple other days of the week, I'd be doing a few hours of cardiovascular exercise and stuff like that. Kind of a hybrid mix of training. I liked to do the cardio training mostly year round. I didn't really have a bulking or cutting season. I'd have various times when I was higher volume of. And I've talked about this in some other videos. Maybe I'll make a more detailed video about how what I found was a more resourceful way for bulking and cutting versus the traditional method of doing that. But suffice to say, at that time, I was doing the traditional bodybuilding style of workouts, about an hour per workout, and then I was doing some cardiovascular exercise as well, not for the purposes of losing weight or cutting body fat or anything like that, simply just because in my background previous to that as being a long distance runner, I still liked to do the running. It just made me feel more alert, more energetic throughout the day versus just doing the strength training. So flash forward now to the current situation that I'm in. I am working like 7 days a week. Got a lot of different things going on. So I don't have the guaranteed time slot to be able to be, predictably doing that same volume of working out as it was before, right? And so now how my workouts typically look is a lot more pared down, smaller, more abbreviated workouts, but more frequently. So I might be training 6 or 7 days a week, but I'm not doing it for an hour, 90 minutes or whatever like I used to. Where you just back-to-back exercises for an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes 90 minutes straight, where you're very fast-paced, but you're putting in a lot of volume and stuff, and you have more time to do that, right? Well, that also takes to that third point of the nutrition status, right? So in order to be able to do that higher volume kind of training, you also need to be fueling yourself in that manner. So before, when I was doing all the bodybuilding training, I was doing a lot of running and stuff like that. I needed to have the fuel to do that. If I did not get in my exercise for that day, my body was used to doing all that stuff. And so I wouldn't be able to focus. I'd be, have a hard time sitting, focusing on my desk and stuff. And on the flip side of that, people who you spend a lot of time sitting all day long, when you get home you think, man, you just sat all day, why don't you go out and exercise? Well, your body is used to sitting, so it wants to do more of what it's already been doing. And so when your body is used to being active all the time, when you start sitting, then if it's used to being active, it's not going to want to sit. So to match my training with my current lifestyle goals, I had to pare back a little bit on the amount of carbohydrates that I was getting in, focusing more on meat, healthy fats, things like that, almost like a cutting sort of diet or a carbohydrate cycling plan, not again for aesthetic reasons, but simply for performance reasons, right? I needed to have enough energy so I could get through workouts, but not so much energy that I could work out all day long like I did before. Because before, I was working manual labor jobs, I was lifting afterwards, and then I was going and doing more cardio on the weekends. And so there was a lot of energy being expended there. I needed to pare that down and adapt to what my current circumstances was. And this now goes to that other point where a lot of people think that, you do all that training and then when you stop doing it, it all turns to fat. No, it doesn't turn to fat. Muscle cannot turn to fat, right? What typically happens is that, and this is actually why people, as they get older, right, typically around, your mid-40s, 50s and stuff like that, you'll see a lot of guys and they'll end up, they've got more body fat on them, right? They're gaining more weight and everything, right? And they haven't necessarily changed anything about how they're eating, right? But what has happened is that if, as early as like your early to mid-20s, if you are not actively doing things to build or maintain your muscle, i.e. resistance training, you start to lose muscle progressively over time. And a year or two ago, I actually did a video about this, talking specifically about the exact quantities of muscle and stuff that you will lose over time. And if you think about that, each pound of muscle is going to burn about 10 calories per day, and you add all that up, it ended up being that the average person if they lost that muscle tissue over time, their base metabolic rate would have decreased by 300 to 500 calories per day by the time they're in their 40s or 50s, right? And so the same thing, a similar thing happens to the person who's this athlete, they train, and they're doing all this muscle stuff, right? Oftentimes, if you don't have a segue of gradually reducing volume and training intensity for a period of, a few months, transitioning from your more competitive or professional career into the regular guy's lifestyle, then you're going to still feel like eating the amount of food that you were prior to that. But now your activity level isn't the same as it was before. And so there's going to be this, and this is actually why after a bodybuilding competition or something like that, a lot of times guys will gain a bunch of muscle or whatever, or gain a bunch of weight post the competition simply because of that rebound effect, right? So now you've suddenly abruptly stopped the volume of training that you're doing, but the calories coming in are still the same, and then it's taking that over. And then if you look at the muscle loss factors too, going forward over time, as your body loses muscle mass, basal metabolic rate decreases as well. If you still continue eating the same as you were prior to that, or even slightly less, with this decreased metabolic rate, you're going to have the predisposition to be adding body fat into your body. So it's not that the muscles themselves are turning into fat, it's that your metabolic rate is slowing down as a result of the loss of muscle mass and the result of lower volume of training, thus less energy expended, and the combination of those two things is causing you to gain weight in the future. So rather than not lifting and not, achieving those heights of athleticism, achieving that great body when you're young or whatever, for fear of it turning to fat later on, as you get older, as your circumstances change, because like I said before, I don't do the same volume of training that I did before, and yet I didn't gain a bunch of body fat as a response to that, right? You simply adjust your diet, your training, do it progressively, slowly over time, so that you can transition from one phase of your life to the next and maintain the highest level of health at all stages of your life. So the second factor that I noted at the beginning of the video had to do with periodization, right? The stages of your training cycle. And so at the stage that I've been at for the past couple of months, actually, and some of that I actually noticed that your training phases will be longer depending on, like, if I get more general physical activity in throughout the day, my body recovers faster, and I'm able to put in more training volume in my strength training sessions as well, right? Whereas when I'm getting less physical activity, those cycles will last longer, right? But the particular stage I'm at now, right, typically you start at, if you're doing a linear periodization program, you're starting out from a point of higher training volume, right? More reps, maybe more sets, but definitely more reps, a little bit lower intensity or lighter load, you're not moving as much weight. And then as you progress, the volume might slightly decrease, right? Or at the very least, your sets and your reps repetitions per set might decrease, while the intensity goes up, and maybe your sets might go up as well. If you're doing 3 sets of 10 or 5 sets of 5 or 6 sets of 8 or something like that, right? Or 4 sets of 8. So there's a variety of those things that can happen, right? And so over time you get to that point to where maybe you get to a point where you're just doing sets of 3 or even just heavy singles. And I was doing that for a long period of time where I just do overhead press and just do a couple sets of single overhead presses, right? And maybe just hold it for a while overhead to get a little bit more core engagement, working the lungs and stuff like that too, breathing while you're stabilizing, things like that. And not actually doing a whole lot of training volume, maybe doing some running and stuff outside of that, but go in there, quickly get up to that heavy working set, hit it, maybe do a couple of singles or something, and then leave it at that. Whereas maybe when you're in that bodybuilding phase, you're doing a lot more repetitions. You're doing like 10 to 15 repetitions, 6 to 8 repetitions, things like that. And then at the beginning of your powerlifting phase, you're starting out with maybe the 5x5, and then you go in your 3 sets, and then maybe you're doing pyramid sets where it's like 10, 7, 5, 3, 1, and then back down in reverse, things like that, right? Well, you might spend a period of time though, where you are actually in this lower volume stage, lifting heavier weight. So this is actually a good time to bring back that point that I was talking about earlier about how I approach bulking and cutting. So early on, when I was 145 pounds after losing all this weight due to the digestive issues that I had in the past, I was following this bodybuilding bulking program, right? And I was consistently eating like 3,000, 3,500 calories a day and got myself up to 185 pounds, right? And that worked okay, but it's in terms of actually being able to work out very well while I was doing that, because I actually wasn't working out that much. And I think a lot of it was that I was naturally meant to be a little bit heavier, and so when I started eating more consistently like this, maybe I got back up to that point or whatever, right? But what I found is that once I started training consistently again too, if I would try to eat more food to compensate for the energy that I was using in the gym, all that kind of stuff like that, is that my body would reject it, right? I would either end up, doing more training volume, doing more running, more activity, and as I talked about in maybe last week's video or something like that, with the, I think the truth about metabolism or something like that, talking about leptin, right? So leptin is that fuel gauge. When you have plenty of calories coming in, it's going to stimulate the body to decrease hunger and go out and expend more energy. And so what I found was actually a more resource. And then the other thing too to make note of, because I was actually talking to a client about this yesterday, is that because he was saying, if I don't eat regularly, sometimes I have to eat because I know I should eat, but if I don't eat regularly, I will lose my appetite and I won't eat, right? And he's like, there's this one time I went out to like this burger joint, right? And I was really hungry at the beginning, but it took a long time to get our order together. And by the time the order came out, I wasn't really that hungry anymore. And my wife has talked about this as well. She's like, I was at like Disneyland or Disney World or something like that. And we were walking around and stuff. I got hungry at some point during the middle of the day. And then it was several hours before we were actually able to go and get something to eat at a restaurant. And by the time that happened, my appetite had gone away, or her appetite had gone away. And so I think a lot of what this points to is the transitions between, because, when you feel hungry, it simply means that the food that was filling up your belly has now moved out of your belly and is actually into different stages of digestion, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to starve if you don't eat right away. And I knew this from when I was a long distance runner. The best times to run was in the morning before you ate something, or right before lunch when the food, you're starting to get just a little bit hungry. Because then you knew that the food was out of the system into your muscles and you could go do it. And you weren't going to cause this conflict between the parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system, which was digesting that food, and the sympathetic fight or flight, which you're doing when you're running. So in my experience is that when you are trying to bulk up or something like that, it's almost better to have a more sedentary sort of job, right? It makes it easier to do this. And case in point, when I am spending a lot of time writing up content, researching for different things, writing up clients' programs, right? I have an easier time eating more food when I'm doing that, fitting in meals more consistently and stuff too, because when you're riding right on the edge between, you have that transition, right? Every time you eat food, insulin is elevated, right? So the fuel wants to go into the muscles. Your appetite is more stimulated, right, to receive that food, right? And then after 3 to 5 hours or something, if you of not eating, your body starts more so like in the 5-hour window, right? But your body starts transitioning away from absorbing food and starts transitioning into expending energy, taking that energy that has been absorbed into the glycogen in your muscles and your liver and stuff like that, and starting to put it out there and use it for fuel, right? Fuel the needs of the body. So if you get really busy, you're on the job, you're walking around doing different stuff like that. One person said one of the best diets is to actually just be super busy, right? Because when you're super busy, you forget about eating until you actually absolutely need to eat, right? And so that's why I find it's a little bit more advantageous to have that, because you got to keep that steady supply of food coming in to keep your appetite stoked up, right? And obviously there does come a point, provided you are eating pretty healthy foods, not a bunch of highly processed junk, that you will get to this point where it's like, I'm just full, I don't want to eat anymore, right? but you can be slightly under eating and not feel like eating either, just because of that transition between, the insulin and the glucagon. So the glucagon is converting things like glycogen and into, sugar, converting it back into sugar, whereas the insulin was, converting the sugar into use for the body, and then if it wasn't used, getting it converted into, into the glycogen stores. So after all of this background information that I gave you here, I say this because I was talking about what is my approach to bulking and cutting, right? And so what I will typically do is that I will start out when in eating normal balanced type meals, right? Maybe start out like take a week off after you go through a training cycle or whatever. Eat as much balanced meals as you want. Get into that calorie surplus, right? Not forcing yourself. Be prior to the start of training, right? And so you're eating, your carbs, fats, proteins, the balanced macros, all that kind of stuff. And then once you start your training, you're doing this high volume training. And what I notice when you're doing more training, if I'm eating too much food and stuff, I'll feel like puking or whatever, right? So I focus on the proteins, the fats, and maybe some vegetables and whatnot, and do this carbohydrate cycling thing. And because of the higher volume of training that you're doing, you're depleting your glycogen stores, you're kind of getting yourself into a more calorie deficit state with this high volume training. And then when you start to, and then at a certain point, a month or two or whatever down the road, you're going to start finding that, you're burning out on this high volume of training. You just can't do the same volume that you could before. And this point is when I transition to more of this powerlifting style of training, right? So your lower volume of training. You're lifting heavier weights, lower reps per set, and then also starting to increase those carbs back up again because you were depleted. And because you were depleted, your body is much more receptive to the nutrients that you're adding back in. Therefore, your gains tend to be greater as well. And then after a period of time of doing this lower volume, higher intensity style of training, you might start feeling a little bit sluggish and everything, right? Because you're kind of getting into this surplus area, right? So initially the gains were really good, and then they start kind of slowing down for a bit, right? And that's the point when you maybe take a deload week or something like that, and then you transition back to the other style of training again, where you're reducing those carbs, increasing the training volume again, until that whole cycle repeats. And I actually found that for me personally, that actually works much better than consciously forcing myself to eat more food, just because my digestive system, and maybe it's because of the digestive issues that I had, but my digestive system just won't be like, processing that food just because I want it to. It won't be like, okay, you're making us eat, 4,000 calories a day or whatever. It's just going to spit it back out, right? So it's better to provide the stimulus to make your body more hungry, and then so that you kind of like I was talking about before with the athlete, transitioning from all this high volume, all this high level of, volume of training back to a more average person's lifestyle, and oftentimes they gain weight. And so you can use that same principle in your training. So rather than as you're trying to build muscle, also trying to eat a lot of food, focus on doing all that lifting and stuff, and then as you get depleted, reduce the volume of training, and then increase the level of food that you're eating, and then you'll notice that you'll have that rebound effect, and oftentimes that's when you'll build some muscle right off that period of time, right? And then you go back to the higher volume of training, a little less calories, and then back and forth like that. And that actually, I find, works a lot better. Okay, so after a really long intro there, what is the ideal training volume to be able to maintain your muscle after you've built it, right? Okay, so what's the ideal training volume to just build muscle in general? And it's going to vary by muscle group, and I'll get into that later on the video for specific body parts, but in general, between 9 to 18 working sets per muscle group per week is ideal for maximizing your muscular growth, right? Now, it takes far less than that to maintain it. In fact, you can maintain muscle on 2 to 5 sets per muscle group per week. So when you're saying, I don't want to do all that high volume of training, I don't want to do all that stuff because then I'll have to do that for the rest of my life. No, it takes a lot of work to get to that point, just like it can take a lot of work to cut yourself down to a certain level of body fat. But to maintain yourself there is a lot easier, provided you're not in that unhealthy range of 4%, 2 to 4% for a bodybuilding competition. But you can maintain like a 10% body fat pretty easily once you get there. Now, it might take a lot of discipline, effort, and work to get to that point, but once you get there, provided you maintain good habits, good eating habits, and you're just stimulating the muscles frequently, you're doing that 2 to 5 sets per week. Maybe you can do a little bit more if you want to. Maybe you can flip-flop back and forth. You have, I'm super busy this week, and stuff. I don't have as much time to train. Let's just get in a couple sets. And then the next week you're like, I'm motivated. Let's do some more sets. You might even make some progress that way. But once you've built it, once you've lost the body fat, once you've built the muscle, it's a lot easier to maintain it. So don't let the thought of, man, I'm going to have to do all this training and all this dieting for the rest of my life, so what's the point of doing it? Don't let that deter you, because it's just false. So to illustrate this point, there was a study by Bikle and colleagues where the trainees followed a 16-week bodybuilding program, so a very well-structured program, and then after that, they transitioned to a 32-week maintenance program. So they were split into 2 different groups. So they had the seniors group, the older group, then these guys were 60 to 75 years of age, and then they had the middle-aged group, and in the middle-aged group, these guys reduced their training volume to 1/9 of what it had been. And in the older group, they decreased it to just 1/3 of the training volume that they had done in the bodybuilding program. And what they found was that after this 32 weeks of this maintenance program, where they were either reduced by down to 1/3 or to 1/9 of the training volume, that they were not only able to maintain their muscle mass while they were doing this, they also continued to increase their strength as well. So before we move on here, I think that it's interesting to note that the individuals who were in the older group were able to, had to maintain a little bit higher training volume than the guys in the younger group to maintain their muscle mass and strength. And this actually goes to the point that, a lot of times when you're younger, you can respond better to most things in general, right? But you can also be lifting heavier weights and stuff. So maybe when you're younger, you're doing a lot of heavier sets on the bench press, the squat, the deadlift, all this kind of stuff, right? As you get older, you should move away from a lot of that heavy training and focus more on higher volume training, more sets, more reps, more total load spread out across the thing. So it might take you a little longer to get through the workout, but not necessarily, simply because when you are lifting more weight, right, energy expenditure scales directly with the amount of weight that you are moving, right? So a guy who's doing a set of 10 with 135 pounds of the squat is going to expend way less energy than a guy who does 300 pounds for a set of 10, right? And so it's going to take the guy who did the 300 pounds for a set of 10 a lot longer to recover in between his sets than the guy who's doing the other one. And so you can use that in your point that if you have to use less weight, you can also be using shorter rest periods, so the length of your workout may not actually be that much longer, even though you are performing more total work in the course of the workout. And it's going to be better for your joints and just your overall benefits for maintaining that lean muscle mass as you get older. Okay, so now to the specific training volume by muscle group, muscle, or body part. So when it comes to the chest and the anterior deltoids in the front here, you don't need a lot of weekly training volume for those to make them grow, right? A lot of the exercises that you're using effectively put those muscles under a lot of stretch, time under tension, under load when you're doing the exercises, and so making them easier to accumulate the required training stimulus to grow. So about 9 to 18 working sets per week for chest and anterior deltoids. If you want to, and this can be done adequately usually with a combination between bench presses, incline bench presses, and if you want to get a little bit more stretch, a little bit more direction right there, you can also incorporate dips. Dips are a great exercise to add into the routine as well as doing exercises like push-ups on parallettes or whatever, where you're going into like that deficit and you get that extra stretch. If you want to actually help perform in a more functional way, you could practice working on your planche progression, right? Which is basically where you're holding you put your hands backwards behind you and you hold your body off the ground, palms flat on the ground like that, and you hold your whole torso off the ground. The training involved in being able to do that builds so much strength, because the principles of training for strength with gymnastics, where you're only using primarily your body weight to do it, it's all about using mechanical advantage and pushing yourself and putting the muscles at a mechanical disadvantage so that you can create more load on the muscle without actually increasing the amount of weight that you're using in the exercise. And that's kind of essentially what Arnold Schwarzenegger's hero, Reg Park, was doing, right? He was doing 1,000-pound calf raises, but it wasn't because he had 1,000 pounds on the thing. He set up the mechanical advantage or disadvantage of the pulley system to make lighter loads significantly heavier when he was doing it. That's the same thing with doing the planche exercise. And the benefit of the planche exercise is that you're not only training chest and shoulders when you're doing it, you're also training the whole core, and including your lower back, your glutes, your hamstrings, and obviously abdominal muscles and stuff when you're doing that exercise, making it a very functional exercise to do as well. All right, back training. This is where the old adage, put your backs into it, really comes into play. So the back can really take a beating. Between 12 to 30 sets for the week is something that would be in the ideal range for building more muscle in the back. And again, the best exercises for this would be, obviously you could be doing your deadlift. Deadlift is good for the erector muscles. You're going to hit a little bit of the lats and stuff too as you're kind of pulling the bar. But if you want to get more lat engagement, obviously doing a variety of different pull-up exercises. If you're trying to get more rhomboid activation, doing wider grip barbell rows can be helpful for that. And then chin-ups can be useful as well too, doing low bar cable rows and stuff. But the back can really handle quite a bit of volume, and again, as I said, about 12 to 30 sets per week. Next up, we have the quadriceps muscle group. And those are the muscles running on down the front of your thighs. These muscles can be hit quite effectively with traditional exercises such as back squats, front squats, seated leg presses, sissy squats, goblet squats, and things of that nature. Reverse Nordic exercises are actually very useful for this too. You sit down with your feet underneath you, come up to where you're kneeling down, but don't have your hamstrings on your knees. You keep your hips pushed through, cross your arms over your chest, lean back as far as you can while still controlling it, and come back up. One of the reasons why this is, along with the sissy squat, is a very effective exercise for increasing quadricep hypertrophy is because, again, in a similar fashion to when you're doing the overhead, if you're doing overhead tricep extensions, it increases the range of motion and thus increases the time under tension, creating more of a hypertrophic stimulus for those muscles. All right, so next up we have the hamstrings. So hamstrings, a lot of times, you'll hear people knocking certain bodybuilders for, their lack of hamstring development. And particularly with a lot of the bodybuilders from the golden age. Like, I'll see this online where they'll be like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he had no hamstrings. And I do think that a lot of times back in that day and age, it's not because they didn't train hard enough or whatever the case may be, but the focus was much more on the aesthetic. They wanted to have more of that emphasis on having a small waist, the wide V-shaped taper, and then having their legs well developed, having kind of that quadricep sweep and stuff like that, but not overly large or overly developed. And so that could be some of the case. So surprisingly, the hamstrings actually don't need a lot of direct work. About 6 to 12 sets per week is sufficient to cause them to grow. You can develop them through a combination of more functional, as I would like to say, functional hamstring exercises like the Romanian deadlift. Even the deadlift is going to work your hamstrings to some degree. You can do Romanian deadlift. You can be doing good morning exercises. You can be doing obviously hamstring curls, and then if you're really strong, and you could be doing the Nordic curl, Nordic hamstring curl, which is typically more utilized more with athletes, particularly sprinters. I remember when I was about, 13, 14 years old, and my dad asked me, he's like, hey, the Russian sprinters used to use this in their training, and that's how they got really fast and whatnot. And so he had me try to do it. At the time, I was running, a few miles a couple days a week, playing a lot of soccer and basketball, and I was not able to do one. I basically was able to lower myself down and not come back up. So definitely a great exercise to at least develop hamstring power and hamstring strength. Maybe hamstring curls in addition to Romanian deadlifts might be a little bit better for hypertrophy. But if you want to develop that athleticism as well, definitely try out the Nordic hamstring curl. Now, who doesn't want to have a nice set of capped off 3D deltoids? It just makes your overall physique look better. And if you are naturally more narrow in the shoulders from a bodybuilding perspective, if you can widen out your deltoids, it's going to give you the illusion of having wider, broader shoulders. In addition to doing things like lat pull downs, wide grip pull-ups, things like that, that will help to expand you out, doing pullovers as well. That can help to, expand, build out those muscles to create that illusion of a very wide, broad shoulders and making your waistline look a little bit smaller. So about 12 to 18 sets for side deltoid development. And what readily comes to mind when we're thinking about these kind of exercises is things like lateral deltoid raises, upright rows, face pulls. Now the face pull is a little bit more rear deltoids and rotator cuff recruitment, so not as much of a side deltoid movement. Now, additionally, in a stabilizer roll, you're going to be using your side delts as well when you're doing the overhead press. But if you really want to optimize their development and their growth, you want to have a little bit more focus on direct side deltoid movement. Now, the exercises that I talked about before, most of the tension is developed at the bottom of the range of motion, right? So you're doing a lateral deltoid raise. It's hard for about, the first half, and then as you get higher up, it's, or I should say, it starts to get hard really towards that middle range here, right? And then you don't get much up higher. So if you're trying to get those higher ranges of motion and hit the full range of motion with that, sometimes lying down on an incline bench like this and bringing the dumbbell down in front of you, bring it up to the side like this, that can help you to get full development in your side deltoid muscles as well. Another one is to use a cable at the gym, right? So if you just take the handle off of the cable attachment, simply grab the little ball on the cable, and you can perform your deltoid raises that way. In recent years, especially on Instagram, there is a lot of people doing this exercise, so you're probably familiar with the cable deltoid fly. Next up, we have every beginning trainee's favorite muscle group, and that is the biceps. Okay, so the biceps you don't actually need a whole lot of direct work for the biceps, simply because in the same manner that when you're doing triceps with a lot of your pushing exercises, those are getting involved as well. When you're doing your pulling exercises, such as pull-ups, bent over rows, chin-ups, things like that, you are even like, your one-arm rows, lat pull-downs, all this kind of stuff, you're engaging your biceps to a certain degree in an assistance fashion for those exercises. So you don't need to do a lot more extra work on those. So 6 to 12 sets of direct bicep work is sufficient to hypertrophy the muscle. Now, you can do this in a couple of ways. Now, if you're trying to, if you're more of a beginner and you don't have a lot of training experience under your belt, throwing in some bicep exercises at the end of your regular pulling workout, right? So maybe you're starting off and you're doing some deadlifts, you're doing some rowing, you're doing some pull-ups, and then towards the end, along with some of your abdominal work, which I like to put ab work with my back work, because you have the hip extension and then you have hip flexion, working back and forth kind of in a superset manner. I found that it's pretty effective to do it that way, maybe doing deadlifts, hanging leg raises, back and forth, back and forth. Now, towards the end of the workout though, you can be throwing in some biceps work. So throwing in your curls, hammer curls, preacher curls, spider curls, all sorts of different variations for directly hitting the biceps on your arms. The other way you can do it is to, in addition to throwing in direct arm work at the end of your back workout, is to have a separate arm day. So you could have some biceps work on your back workout and then have a separate arm workout as well. And since it doesn't take a lot of like, arms don't really fatigue you that much when you're doing an arm workout, right? You could probably get through an entire arm workout in about half an hour, and then that leaves you a little bit of time afterwards to do more like skill work, mobility work, maybe even do a little bit of cardio. The way I used to do it is I would hit my arms and then I'd go out and do some running or something like that after I was done doing my arm workout. So the triceps are very similar to the biceps in regard to the amount of volume that you need to stimulate growth. Again, in that 6 to 12 sets per week range to optimize her hypertrophy. Now, for a beginner, simply doing overhead presses, bench presses, dips, and then close grip bench presses are going to be probably sufficient to develop your triceps, right? You can also be doing push-ups, right? And you're going to be hitting your anterior deltoids, your chest, your triceps. A lot of these exercises are multifunctional, right? It's also good if you don't have a lot of time to train. However, if you do want to optimize or maximize the development of your triceps, get those, horseshoe shaped triceps, get the Lee Priest looking, development there, then you do want to do some direct work for it, because when you're doing these compound movements, as functional as the compound movements are, as optimal as they are for developing overall muscular development and strength because of them using multiple muscles at once, they really don't optimize the full range of motion of the triceps, right? So for example, you're doing the bench press, at certain points of the movement, the triceps are active, and then not so much at other points of the movement, right? You really don't get that deep stretch all the way down to the armpit when you're doing them. And actually, a couple weeks ago, so I'm a member of a local business networking group called BNI, and for a long time, I've been trying to get some help recruiting some guys to try what I call my hybrid strength program. And I finally got a guy who works for a moving company to come and try out one of my workouts. He's also a member of the Army Reserves, and then he's been doing powerlifting for about 6 years or so, right? And so he's about 175 pounds, about 5'7", bench presses, like 375 pounds, squats over 500 pounds, and deadlifts around 600 or so, right? So pretty strong dude. And I took him through my workout. Towards the end of the workout, we were doing more isolation bodybuilding style of training and stuff. And I introduced him to a new style to do the skull crusher. So two of the best exercises, in my opinion, for developing your triceps, and particularly the outer head of the triceps, so on this side here, is doing some form of skull crusher or an overhead tricep extension. I like to do the standing or kneeling down overhead tricep extension. You can do it seated on a bench as well, but most of the time for me, because my focus is on functionality, I like to do it in the standing position because you have to then engage your core as well. If you're really trying to optimize muscular development though, sometimes having more stability so you can really don't have to focus as much on core stability, and you can put all your energy into just focusing on the muscle at hand. So how this is helpful is that you can really get that full range of motion, take the muscle to its full extent, and then contracting from the bottom of the range. And that's why a lot of times I'll talk about bodybuilding really being like yoga with weights, right? It's not about how much weight are you moving, it's about getting that full range of motion, kind of like Tom Platz, right? You're really stretching the muscle to its full extent and then contracting it back. And over time, the amount of weight that you use to be challenging within a desired repetition range is going to have to increase, and that's when you increase the weight. So the goal is not how much weight can I move, it's how much can I stress the muscle. And really, if you, again, going back to the example of the planche exercise I was talking about before for chest and shoulder development, if you can put the muscle at a mechanical disadvantage, it really doesn't take that much weight to fatigue the muscle and overload it. So this gentleman that I was introducing to my hybrid strength program at the end of the push day, because I split it into a pushing day and a pulling day. And at the end of that workout, after doing bench presses, we had him doing some skull crushers, right? And so he would do the skull crusher, how it sounds, right? Where you bring it down to your forehead and bring it back up. Now, a much better way to engage your triceps, and he actually was like, man, this is the first time I've ever actually been able to get right down here in where that tricep inserts into the armpit here, was when you're laying on that bench, you push it straight up, and then as you're breathing in, bring your arms back, keeping the elbows straight up until this point. You bring your arms back up until maybe about 30 degrees from the perpendicular position. So you bring your upper arms back here, and then from that position, now you bend it, bring it all the way back as far as it'll go, and then straighten out. But you're not bringing your arm up and down like this, like a pullover. You keep it in that position, and so when you straighten your arm out, maybe, so you're back like this, right? And you got this angle with the arm. When you bend, then you straighten it out, and the arm is always at about that, 60 degrees or whatever from parallel. So, or 30 degrees from the perpendicular position. And that right there is actually the best way to stimulate that deep muscle contraction all the way down there at the insertion point in the shoulder joint for your tricep muscle. All right, next up we've got forearms. So I know a lot of guys that want to have those Popeye forearms. Maybe their biceps grow okay, but they got these little stick forearms. And I think a lot of guys, they want to have, you've seen some of these pictures of Arnold, or not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but Sylvester Stallone, right? And he's got these really beefy, looking forearms and whatnot, right? Or you've got John Cena, just thick arms, right? I used to tell one of my roommates back in the day that I liked some of the bodybuilders who had a little bit smaller joints and larger muscle bellies and stuff, because I thought it looked more aesthetic. But he's like, nah, I want to be like John Cena, have these super thick bones and stuff like that. And I think overall, having the more muscular forearms and stuff gives that impression of strength and power, right? And honestly, you don't really necessarily need to do too much direct forearm work. Growing up as a kid, I was doing a lot of chores around the house, a lot of manual labor stuff later on. And when you're doing, labor type jobs and whatnot, your forearms get worked quite a bit. So oftentimes you'll see guys who are mechanics, or they work in warehouses or in construction or whatever, and they'll have decent forearm development, even though if their upper arms are lacking, simply just from the nature of the work that they're doing. The other thing is that when you are doing just training in general, most exercises that you use, you have to grip the bar, grip the dumbbell or whatever, just to hold on to it. And so your forearms are going to be worked quite extensively. So anywhere between 0 to 18 working sets per week is good for the forearms. Now, the forearms, again, are a high endurance muscle. They can handle a lot of volume. One thing that a lot of guys will use is they'll use lifting straps when they're doing their deadlifts or they're rowing. And this actually makes a lot of sense once you start getting stronger, is that your back muscles, are a lot stronger than your forearm muscles. Your forearm muscles are more of a endurance type muscle, right? And so the back can actually support a lot more weight than your arms. So the limiting factor tends to be your hands. Your hands and your forearms tend to give out before your back will. So how you can get around this, if you find that your forearm development is lacking, then as you're building up on your warm-up sets to your working sets for your deadlifts or your rows or whatever, don't use lifting straps, right? Use just your hands, and you'll be training the forearms that way, training your grip strength. Also, if you're doing farmer's carries and whatnot, you're getting a lot of isometric time under tension there for the forearms when you're doing it. And then once you get up to your working sets, then you can use the straps, and then maybe do some deload or some drop sets after that, if that's involved in your program, again without using the lifting straps, so that you're training more forearm development. And so I understand both perspectives. If your goal is to build as much muscle as possible, you don't want the limiting factor to be this small muscle group in your forearms, and your back isn't tired out or fatigued properly enough to cause it to grow more, and so then it would make sense to use the lifting straps. The other thing is, Again, if you're using suitcase carries, farmer's carries, if you're doing pull-ups, right? Any sort of thing where you're supporting your body weight, hanging from bars, things like that, those are going to be all great exercises to work your grip. Now, some guys will talk about, pinching some plates between your hands and carrying that, doing wrist curls and whatnot. And I actually found that just gripping the barbells, carrying heavy loads, hanging from pull-up bars is plenty, and actually seems to actually work your forearms just as good, if not better, than doing direct work for them. Before moving on to the next section, I would say by far the best forearm exercise I have ever had was one time when I went down to the playground and I went on the bar over the swing sets, and I was just swinging back and forth, right? And I would allow my grip to open up just a little bit as I was swinging and then come back down. And at the time, I'm doing like 100 plus pounds or whatever with wrist curls and stuff. And but obviously your body weight is heavier than that, and plus you have the momentum swinging you out. The following day, my forearms were like almost cripplingly sore from doing that. So you might want to try that out. Go to your local playground or just get up on a pull-up bar. And I think the advantage of it is that the bar for that is a lot fatter than a pull-up bar, and so you can't fully grip it, and so you have to have that stronger grip strength to do it. And so if you're trying to build your forearm strength, definitely give that exercise a try. A little unorthodox, but hey, doing whatever works, not whatever looks pretty. So along with the biceps and the chest, the abs are probably another favorite exercise of people going to the gym, trying to improve their physique, trying to build more muscle, right? These are the exercises you're going to see in the mirror, the exercise you see at the beach. You can be really strong or whatever and stuff, but if you don't have a good set of abs, oftentimes it doesn't look quite as impressive, right? So, understandably so, a lot of guys like to train their abs. Reality is, though, with proper diet, right, you don't really need to do too much direct work for your abdominals. So again, it's kind of like the forearms. 0, you don't have to train them at all, or you can do 18 sets a week if you'd like. Again, as I said before, I used to do hundreds, and at one time did 1,700 sit-ups in one shot just to prove a point to my cousins. And now I barely ever train my abs directly, and if anything, I have better ab development than I had back then, simply because I eat a proper diet. I remain either in a balance or a slight deficit most of the time so that you can reveal the abdominals there, and then I just do compound movements, and then also exercises like your pull-ups, right? So if you do want to do direct ab work, after you've done your deadlifts, your squats, because to be able to brace your core while you're doing these exercises, you're going to be training that, and you have hundreds of pounds on your back, or you're lifting hundreds of pounds off the floor. That's going to do more for you than just doing hundreds and hundreds of sit-ups, right? Or even crunches, right? So with that being said, other exercises that can be good for engaging your core would be doing suitcase carries, right? You just, grab a barbell or a heavy dumbbell in one hand, or even a heavy kettlebell, and you just walk for a bit, put one hand behind your head, and because it's offset, to prevent yourself from tipping over, the obliques have to clamp down really hard on that one side, and it helps build functional core stability. Another favorite of mine is doing hanging leg raises. Those are fun. Hollow body holds, which are kind of a gymnastics movement. Just doing simple pull-ups by themselves. So when you're hanging from the pull-up bar, if you begin while you're hanging by engaging your stomach, rotating your tailbone under, right, like you're a hornet or a wasp, right? So tucking the tailbone under, you're engaging the abdominals, and then retracting your shoulder blades, or not retracting them, depressing the shoulder blades, so pushing them down towards your pockets in the back here, and then initiate the pull that way. That exercise there, pull-ups, actually simple pull-ups by themselves, are one of the best abdominal exercises out there. And so again, going to that fact that simply sometimes incorporating exercises in there will help you as well. Other ones that I like to do, Russian twists, obviously are a pretty fun exercise. You can be doing a corkscrew exercise, which I've shown in some of my videos a couple years ago. I haven't done them in recent times, but all these exercises are pretty good to do. And again, really when it comes down to being able to see your abdominals has to do with having low enough body fat percentage, which often comes down to a combination of the workouts you're doing, which if you want to be able to burn the most amount of body fat the most efficiently in a workout sense, doing full body movements, doing explosive movements, sprints, box jumps, athletic type development stuff in conjunction with your compound movements. That's some things that I do in my hybrid strength program, the specific order going from strength, power, bodybuilding, and then endurance work, and then obviously combining with a sound dietary plan to make that happen. Because if your diet isn't right, you can do all the training you want in the world, and it's going to be very, very hard for you to get your abs visible. All right, so what about your butt muscles or your glutes? So in recent, probably the past decade or so, the popularity of training your butt has increased exponentially. In the past, it was like, let's shrink your butt down. Now, it seems like a lot of girls at the gym, they want to grow their butt, get their butt bigger, and stuff like that, increase butt development. Now, glutes, having strong glutes is important. One of the reasons why you'll see some of these players in the NBA, some of these black guys, they got really skinny, pencil-thin legs, and yet they can jump out of the building. Why is that? If you have strong glutes, you're able to extend the hips. That's mostly where the power comes for being able to jump. It doesn't come from your calves. And so if you want to be able to run faster, if you want to improve the health of your knees, having some level of strength and in your butt is going to help. If you ever see somebody running down the road and they kind of run like this, you know that they pretty much have weak butt muscles. And with the prevalence of people sitting down at the job, on the job, you tend to have people with shortened hip flexors and also weak or amnesia glutes, right? So the glutes are not firing properly when they are even doing exercises like squats and deadlifts, right? Because simply doing squats and deadlifts can effectively train your glutes, particularly the deadlifts. If you're doing a heavy deadlift, right, and you're not transferring it up into your back, at the initiation of that, as you're pulling the first couple inches off the ground, you can really feel that your glute is really getting stretched and right where the tie-in between your butt and your hamstrings as well. So that can be effective. Now, in terms of the squat, whether or not it is an effective glute or butt builder, it really comes down to something called anthropometrics, or the ratio between the length of your limbs. So if you have shorter shins versus your thigh bones, right, and also the length of your torso. Also, how much mobility do you have in your ankles, and are you doing a high bar squat? So putting the bar up across your traps, or are you doing a low bar squat where it's down a little bit lower across your rhomboids, right? And so if you're doing a low bar squat, it's going to be a more hip dominant movement, right? And it's going to allow you to develop your glutes a lot more, right? Now, doing the high bar squat and even doing front squats is going to be a lot more quadricep dominant, right? So that can be the little caveat there with the squat. And then there is also the individual variation in between one person to the next, depending on how that ratio between the limb lengths there is going to affect how your hips move in the performance of the squat. So you don't really need to do too much direct glute work if you are doing the basics properly. However, it can be helpful from time to time, again, in the same context with the abs, to get a little bit more mind-muscle connection between and get the feel for that using a little bit lighter loads, so that when you come back to these compound movements, you are able to then recruit those muscles a little bit better in the movement. All right, second to last exercise or muscle group we're going to talk about is the calves. Now the calves, on some people, they are a lot bigger, right, by nature. My dad tends to have a little bit bigger calves naturally. I've known some other people have bigger calves, and a lot of it is genetic, just as anything in a bodybuilding sense tends to be genetic, right? Where your muscles insert, the length of the muscles, and the fiber distribution within the muscle can determine your overall results in a bodybuilding context, right? But with that being said, the calves tend to, because you're walking around all day long and they have a high distribution of slow twitch muscle fibers, right? Particularly the soleus, which lies underneath the larger outer gastrocnemius muscle, tends to have a high fatigue or anti-fatigue potential, right? So high distribution of slow twitch muscle fibers. It's going to take a long time to fatigue it, and as such, you can. It is a good idea to do a lot of direct calf work on top of that. In addition to doing things like sled pushes, sprinting up hills, those all help to develop your calves, and so anywhere between like 12 to 18 sets per week is going to be good. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger was talking about how early on in his bodybuilding career, he had decent-sized calves, but in proportion to the rest of his body, being a taller individual as well, they just didn't look that impressive. They looked a little bit smaller, right? And so he went down, at the time, he was doing calf raises with 300 pounds, right? And he thought that was pretty good. Well, then he goes down to South Africa to train with his hero, Reg Park. And Reg Park had the cable system set up such that he was able to do 1,000-pound calf raises. And so with these 1,000-pound calf raises, he was doing, a lot of sets with it too, and he was training high frequency as well, multiple times a week. And so this totally reshaped Arnold's concept of what was actually possible. So when he gets back to the States, he starts training as well, and he would intentionally, wear sweatshirts and stuff like that, cover up the rest of his body, and then he cut off the bottoms of all of his sweatpants so that his weak point or his calves would always be visible, and he would feel self-conscious and therefore more inspired to train them, right? And so what he ended up doing was training very, very high volume, very high frequency, almost every day, doing 15 to 20 sets just for calves. And after a couple years of doing this, his calves actually became so big that people thought he had actually got implants in his calves to make them look bigger. All right, so last but not least, training your neck. Admittedly, I don't train my neck very much at all. However, it's probably not a bad idea to do that, particularly if you want to do combat sports, if you want to do, full contact sports, football, rugby, things like that where you're going to be jostling, your neck might be compromised, right? Also, a lot of guys don't want to have this big bodybuilder physique with a little pensile neck, right? And so I guess the other benefit just for the regular guy who doesn't want to be a big bodybuilder or whatever is that when you're sitting in front of a desk all day, if you're sitting on your phone and stuff, you tend to get weaker in these muscles here, and then your head starts to push forward, right? And you start to get tighter in your cervical extensors on the back there, right? And so some exercises that I like to do, obviously you can do neck curls, you can do neck extensions. They actually have a thing where you can put this like little cap on your head, you have some chains, and you can do this kind of stuff, right? Now, working underneath a car as an auto mechanic, or you're laying on your back or something like that, doing this kind of stuff, that is an excellent exercise for your SCM or sternocleidomastoid muscles, these muscles along here on the bottom of your neck. Another one you can do is simply lay down on the floor and lift, grab kind of like along the sides of your jaw here, put your fingers on the back of your head, and just rotate forward like this, lengthening out the back of your neck. And then once you're in that position, also trying to keep your ribs down, hold that position. And when you start feeling tension and start getting a little bit fatigued in the back of the neck, you know that these muscles have become fatigued as well, and now you're transferring the stress back to the back of the neck. So what you do in that case is relax, allow you to sit down to the ground, reset yourself, and do a couple more sets like that. It's a really good exercise to help counteract that prolonged sitting that you're doing at the job. And then as you become stronger, you can, start adding, weights and stuff to your head. You can put like a foam roller against a wall, tuck your head in like this, and then support your body with your neck muscles. That's also a good way to train your neck. All right, guys, so that is the end of this very, very long video on how much volume is required to not only build muscle, but to maintain your muscle after you have built it, right? And as we talked about before, 9 to 18 sets per week, per muscle group to optimize muscular hypertrophy. However, once you get there, 2 to 5 sets per week should be sufficient to be able to maintain it, provided you get a proper diet as well. And then with those trainees, the groups that we talked about before, older individuals need a little bit higher volume, a little lower intensity, a little lower weight, and that's beneficial for guys as they get older. If you're 50 plus years old and stuff, maybe not maxing out on your bench press and your deadlifts and your squat all the time isn't the best idea. Doing a little bit more circuit style training a little bit higher rep ranges and lightening the weight a little bit. You're going to put more tension on your muscles. You're going to improve your cardiovascular health as well doing this too, and make it so that you're going to be able to maintain your muscle in the future and keep your joints healthy for as long as possible, which is kind of the point. It's nice to lift really heavy weight, move a lot of weight and stuff like that, nothing wrong with that, but ultimately at the end of the day, I don't want to end up like a Ronnie Coleman where I've got my hips all shot out and my back is screwed up, and so it becomes much harder to train in the future, right? So anyway, if you guys liked the information in this video, hit that like button. If you'd like to see more content related to the design of a workout for building muscle, losing body fat, improving athletic performance, how to work around injuries should you sustain them, and how to prevent them from occurring in the first place, consider subscribing to the channel by hitting the button in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And we'll see you all next time for more health and fitness information.